The night she walked out of that blizzard and into the firelight of Elias Kane's camp, neither of them knew that nothing would ever be the same again. She was half frozen, her boots cracked at the soles, her dark hair matted with ice crystals that caught the orange glow of the fire like something from a painting no one had commissioned yet. She stood at the edge of the tree line, just stood there, watching him the way a wounded animal watches something it cannot yet decide to trust. He saw her first. He always said that later when the story became theirs to tell. I saw you first. Like that meant something. Like seeing first was the same as knowing first, but maybe in this case it was. May I warm up by your fire, she whispered. And Elias Kane, a man who had spent 7 years alone on the frontier and had long ago stopped expecting the world to surprise him, looked up from the flames, looked at her, really looked at her, and said the 4 words that would rearrange everything. It was yours already. She didn't understand what he meant. Not that night. She was too cold, too tired, too hollowed out by whatever had driven her across 40 miles of Wyoming wilderness in the middle of January with nothing but a canvas saddlebag and a rifle she hadn't loaded in 3 days. Her name was Sable Voss, 19 years old, born in a mining town that no longer existed, raised by a grandmother who had taught her to read stars and track elk and distrust men who smiled too quickly. She wasn't running from anyone in particular. She was running from the accumulated weight of everything, a life that had never quite fit the shape of her body, a future that everyone else had already decided for her, a town that had looked at her one too many times like she was a problem to be solved. She sat down across the fire from Elias without asking again. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. She took it without speaking. They sat in the kind of silence that 2 people only sit in when they are either complete strangers or something beyond what words have names for yet. The fire popped. A log shifted. Snow fell somewhere deep in the pines, heavy and slow, the way snow falls when the world has decided to be quiet. Elias watched the flames. Sable watched Elias. He was not what she had expected. She had expected what? A trapper, maybe. A grizzled old mountain man with hands like bark and eyes like flint. Instead, she found a man of perhaps 32, lean and deliberate in the way that men who work alone become deliberate, every movement considered, nothing wasted. He had dark eyes that caught firelight the way deep water catches light, holding it without giving it back. His jaw was stubbled. His coat was old but well kept. On his left hand he wore no ring, though she noticed everything, that he touched the 4th finger of that hand sometimes, absently, the way you touch a scar you've stopped thinking about. "You're not going to ask me anything," she said finally. He looked up from the fire. Those dark eyes settled on her face with a kind of patience she had never experienced from anyone before. Not urgency, not suspicion, just patience. "Not tonight," he said. She stared at him. "Why not?" "Because whatever you're carrying," he said, "it'll still be there tomorrow, and you don't need to put it down twice." Sable Voss, who had not cried in 4 years and had promised herself she would not cry in the next 4, felt something shift dangerously behind her sternum. She looked back at the fire. "I'm not staying," she said. "All right. Just tonight." "All right. Don't make anything of it." He almost smiled. She could see it in the corner of his mouth, the way a smile lives before it decides to become one. "I won't make anything of it," he said quietly, "if you won't." She didn't know what that meant either, not yet. She was still there a week later. It happened without either of them deciding it. That was the thing about Elias Kane's camp. It had a gravity to it, slow and steady, the kind you don't feel until you've already been pulled in. He was wintering in a line cabin at the edge of the Kane family's old grazing territory, 3 days' ride from the nearest town, deep in a valley that trapped warmth and silence in equal measure. The cabin was small, 1 room, a loft, a stone fireplace that Elias had rebuilt with his own hands 2 winters ago because the original mortar had given out. There was a barn with 4 horses and a mule. There was a root cellar stocked with enough to last through March. There was a woodpile taller than Sable's head. There was no particular reason for her to stay. There was no particular reason for her to leave, either. That was what she told herself. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. She had never been anywhere that felt like this. Quiet in a way that wasn't emptiness. Solitary in a way that wasn't loneliness. She had spent her whole 19 years surrounded by noise, the noise of her grandmother's town, the noise of men who wanted things from her, the noise of her own mind telling her she was wrong, strange, too much, not enough, out of place in a world that had been built without her in mind. Here there was only the fire, and the snow and Elias. And Elias was, she struggled to name it, even in her own thoughts, Elias was safe. Not safe the way a locked door is safe. Safe the way open sky is safe. He didn't crowd her. He didn't study her. He moved through the cabin with a kind of self-contained ease, and when she was near him she felt strangely like she took up exactly the right amount of space. She started helping with the morning chores, not because he asked. He never asked. But she watched him haul water from the creek, watched him break ice from the trough, watched him move through the cold with that unhurried deliberateness, and something in her hands wanted to be useful. She took over the barn duties. He let her without comment, without gratitude that felt like debt. Just a nod, one morning, as she came back in from feeding the horses, and something in that nod said, "I see you," without saying anything at all. They cooked together in the evenings. Or rather, Elias cooked, and Sable sat at the table and talked, and slowly, day by day, she found herself saying things she had never said aloud to anyone. "I don't know what I look like to other people," she said one night, watching him stir a pot of venison stew. "Like, I know what I look like, but I don't know what they see." Elias didn't turn around. He kept stirring. "What do you think they see?" "Something that doesn't make sense," she said. "Something that's supposed to be one thing and keeps being another." He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Steam rose from the pot. "I know something about that," he said at last. She wanted to ask him what he meant. She didn't. Instead, she watched the back of his neck, the way his shoulders held some kind of old weight that had settled into muscle and bone, and she thought, "There is a whole story in this man that I will probably never hear." The thought made her chest ache in a way she couldn't explain. His name was Elias Kane, and he had been alone for a long time. Not always alone in body. He'd had a partner once, years back, a man named Thomas who had worked this same land with him, who had laughed at the same dark sky, who had known things about Elias that Elias had barely known about himself. But Thomas had left, not in anger, in grief, which was worse. He'd gone east, back to his family, back to a life that had a shape the world recognized. He'd written once, a year later, a letter so careful and so full of apology that Elias had read it 3 times and then fed it to the fire, not out of bitterness, but because he didn't need the paper to remember what it said. He had never told anyone about Thomas. There was no one to tell. The frontier was not a place that had language for what he and Thomas had been to each other, and even if it had been, Elias was not a man who handed his heart to strangers. He was not sure, 7 years on, whether he still had a heart left to hand. And then a girl walked out of a blizzard and sat down across his fire and looked at him like she was trying to read a map in a language she didn't know yet. And something in Elias, something he'd thought was finished, stirred in his chest like an ember catching air. He told himself it was protectiveness. She was young. She was alone. She was carrying something heavy that she hadn't named yet. It was natural to want to help. He told himself that for approximately 4 days before he stopped believing it. The moment that changed things happened on a Thursday. He knew it was Thursday because he kept a small journal, not of feelings, he would have been embarrassed to call it that, but of weather and livestock and tasks completed, the kind of record a working man kept. He had written Thursday at the top of the page, and then looked up to find Sable sitting at the table, with one of his books open in front of her chin in her hand, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, reading with the kind of complete absorption that made her look entirely unguarded. He had never seen her unguarded before. She was always watchful, always holding something back behind those gray eyes, some awareness of exits and angles and the spaces between words. It was the wariness of someone who had learned that the world required constant monitoring. He recognized it because he'd worn it himself. But right now, reading his battered copy of Moby Dick with her boots off and her feet tucked under her, and the firelight making her look like a painting of herself, she had forgotten to be watchful. He stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched like taffy, longer than it should have been, and he felt something happen in his chest that he had absolutely no framework for. She looked up. For one suspended second, neither of them said anything. Her eyes were wide, caught off guard, caught being soft, and his face must have shown something because her cheeks went a color he had never seen on her before, a warm rose that started at her jaw and climbed. "I hope you don't mind," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "I got bored and I found I should have asked." "I don't mind," he said, too quickly. He made himself walk into the room normally, made himself go to the fireplace and add a log like that was the reason he'd come back inside early. Like the reason wasn't that he'd been standing in the cold thinking about the way she'd said good morning to him that day, a little softer than usual. "It's a good book," she said. "It's a long book." "I like long things." She paused. "Long books, I mean, books that take a while where you have time to know the people in them." He crouched by the fire, keeping his eyes on the flames. "What do you know about Ahab so far?" "That he's in love with something that can't love him back," she said. "And it's going to destroy him, and he knows it, and he's going to chase it anyway." Elias looked up at her. She was looking at him. The fire made sounds. The cabin settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing, like the whole frozen world was alive and watching. "That's a good reading," he said quietly. "I've known people like that," she said, and then, softer, "I've been a little like that." He didn't ask her who. He didn't ask her what. He just looked at her and she looked at him, and the moment lasted exactly as long as it needed to before she dropped her eyes back to the book and he stood and went to start dinner, and neither of them said another word about it. But the room was different after that. Some invisible membrane had dissolved. They both felt it. They moved around each other differently, a little more carefully, a little more aware, the way two people move when they've stopped pretending they don't know the other one is there. The snow came down hard that weekend. Not a blizzard, not the savage thing that had driven Sable to his fire in the first place, but a deep, steady snowfall that buried the valley in white and sealed the cabin in silence. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but be in the same small space, tending the same fire, breathing the same air. Elias got out a deck of cards. They played for 3 hours. He won more than she did, but not by as much as he expected. She was sharp, quick-minded, with a gambler's instinct for reading faces, except that she kept losing the thread of the game when he looked at her, which happened, as the evening went on, more and more often. "You're doing that thing again," she said. He laid down a card. "What thing?" "Looking at me like you're trying to figure out a problem." "Maybe I am." She met his eyes. The candle between them threw shadows across both their faces. "What's the problem?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said with complete honesty, "I'm not sure yet." She held his gaze for a beat too long. Then she looked at her cards. "I don't like being a problem." "I didn't say you were a problem," he said. "I said you were like a problem. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" He considered this. "Problems bother you," he said. "What I meant is more like a question, something you keep turning over, not because it's troubling you, because you want to understand it." The silence that followed, was the loudest thing Sable had ever heard. "What's the question?" she asked. Her voice came out lower than she intended. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his eyes, something careful and complex, like weather-making decisions. "I think," he said slowly, "that's still developing." She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the loft, listening to him breathe in the room below, and stared at the ceiling and felt the thing in her chest that had no name yet, the thing that had been growing since she sat across his fire for the first time, and she thought, this is a problem. This is an actual problem, not the question kind. She found out about Thomas on a Wednesday, 22 days after she'd arrived. She wasn't snooping. She was looking for a spare candle. She'd asked Elias where he kept them, and he'd said top shelf, left of the window, and then ridden out to check on the north fence line. And she'd pulled the wrong box down, and a small bundle of letters had slid out onto the table. She had not read them. She had not needed to. The handwriting on the top envelope was bold and slanted, a man's hand, and the name below the wax seal said Elias in that same bold script, and the letter inside, which she had not opened but which had been opened many times before, the envelope worn soft as cloth was folded in thirds, and on the back of the envelope in different ink, in what she recognized as Elias' careful handwriting, were two words. Still true. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. She found the candles on the correct shelf. She lit one and sat at the table and stared at it for a long time. She thought about the way he touched his left hand sometimes. She thought about the things he'd said. I know something about that, about being something the world couldn't quite make sense of. She thought about 7 years alone in a valley at the edge of the world, and a man who kept letters that said still true, and what kind of love leaves a mark so deep you carry it written on the back of its own envelope. She thought about herself, about the things she'd never said to anyone, about the town she'd left and the shape of the future people had tried to hand her like a gift she hadn't asked for, about the way she'd always looked at women and at men and felt differently each time, felt the difference as clearly as the difference between daylight and dark, and about how she had never, in 19 years, said that aloud, had never trusted anyone enough, had never found the right language or the right moment or the right person. She thought, maybe this is why it felt safe here. Maybe you recognize something before you can name it. Elias came back at dusk, stamped the snow from his boots, and stopped when he saw her face. "You found the letters," he said. It wasn't a question, he was very still. "By accident," she said. "I didn't read them." He came to the table slowly. He didn't sit. He stood across from her and looked at her the way he always looked at her, patient, careful, deep, but now there was something else underneath it, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before, a held breath. "I should have put them somewhere better," he said. "You don't owe me that." "I know I don't." He sat down. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "His name was Thomas. He worked this land with me for 3 years. He left because the world outside this valley didn't have space for what we were, and he chose the world." Sable didn't say anything. She just looked at him. "I've never told anyone that," he said. His voice was very level, the way voices get level when they're carrying weight. "I know," she said. "You're not," he paused, recalibrated. "You're not troubled by it." "No," she said simply. He looked at her for a long time. "Why not?" She thought about it, about how to answer, and then she said, quietly, looking at the candle flame rather than his face, "Because I'm not exactly simple myself." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences, fuller, warmer, like something that had been held tight for a long time had finally been given permission to open. "No," said Elias Kane, and his voice was soft as snowfall. "No, I didn't think you were." After that, something between them changed again, deepened. Like a river in thaw, the surface still quiet, still careful, but underneath a current that hadn't been there before, strong and sure and going somewhere. They talked differently now. Not about everything, Not about the letters, not about Thomas again, not about whatever she had meant by not exactly simple, but around those things, the way you talk around a campfire, the fire at the center giving light to everything without being the thing you're discussing. He told her about the land, about the Kane family history, his father who had broken this valley, his brother who'd sold his share and gone to California, himself who had stayed because leaving felt like something he was not capable of. "I'm made of this place," he said once, looking out the window at the snow. "I don't think I could be who I am somewhere else." She told him about her grandmother, about the star charts her grandmother kept, all hand-drawn on butcher paper, entire night skis mapped in pencil and marked with notes in a cramped, certain hand. About the night her grandmother had shown her the constellation Cassiopeia and told her. She was vain and she was punished for it, but they put her in the sky anyway, because the sky keeps everyone. Sable had been 9 years old and she had never forgotten it. "The sky keeps everyone," Elias repeated. "That's what she said." "Smart woman." "The smartest," Sable paused. "She died 2 years ago. I think that's when I started, when things started feeling too small, like the town got smaller after she left it." "Grief does that," Elias said. "Makes you feel like the walls are moving in." "Is that what happened with Thomas, after?" She hadn't planned to say his name. It came out quietly, carefully, like a word in a foreign language she was testing for the first time. Elias was still for a moment. Then, yes, for a while the walls moved in, and then I just stayed still, waited for them to stop. "Did they?" He looked at her. "They're stopping," he said. The candle flame went very bright for a moment, or maybe that was just her eyes. January turned to February, and the valley held its breath. Sable had stopped telling herself she was leaving soon. She had stopped framing her presence in the cabin as temporary, which was either foolishness or honesty, and she wasn't sure yet which. She wrote letters she didn't send to her grandmother, to the version of herself she'd been 6 months ago, in the back of a small notebook she'd bought in the last town she'd passed through. She wrote about the way the light came through the cabin window in the mornings. She wrote about Elias' hands, which were careful and scarred and expressive in a way the rest of him wasn't. She wrote about the feeling of sitting across from someone who didn't require you to perform. She did not write about the way her heart moved when he was near. Some things are too large for notebooks. He was teaching her to track. They went out in the mornings when the snow held good prints: elk, fox, the occasional mountain lion that made Elias' eyes go alert and careful. He showed her how to read the depth and angle of a track, what it said about speed and weight and intention. He showed her how a running animal's prints differed from a walking animal's. He showed her the difference between what a trail said and what a trail meant. "Everything leaves a mark," he said one morning, crouched in the snow beside the trail of something large. "The question is whether you know how to read it." She was crouched beside him. Their shoulders were nearly touching. She could feel the warmth of him through 2 layers of wool. "What does my trail say?" she asked. He turned to look at her. He was very close. His breath made small white clouds in the cold air. His dark eyes held something she'd been trying to name for 3 weeks. "That you've been moving fast for a long time," he said, "and that you've been moving alone." She couldn't look away from him. She should have looked away. She did not look away. What else? He looked at her for a long moment. The cold air sat between them like held breath. "That you're slowing down," he said quietly. She felt her heart do something involuntary and embarrassing. She stood up and looked at the horizon and said, very casually, "We should check the ridge line before the light goes." "We should," he agreed, and she could hear from his voice that he was almost smiling. She walked ahead of him on the trail back, and spent the entire walk pretending her face was cold rather than anything else. The trouble, when it came from outside. His name was Garrett Foss. He rode into the valley on a gray horse in the second week of February, a man of perhaps 45 with a rancher's build and a rancher's confidence, and eyes that assessed everything for value. He was a neighbor of sorts. His land bordered Kane territory to the east, and he came under the pretext of a fence dispute that had apparently been ongoing for years. Sable was in the barn when she heard the horse. She stayed there, her hand on the neck of Elia's gray mare, listening through the barn wall as the two men's voices carried across the yard. Foss's voice was easy and carrying, the voice of a man who had always been the largest presence in any room. "Winter treating you all right, Kane? Quiet up here, I imagine. Just you and the wind." A pause. "Though I heard in town you had some company." "I have a hand wintering with me," Elia said. His voice was even, careful. "Young woman," they said. Another pause. Sable could hear the calculation in it, the subtle shift. "That's a long way from town for a young woman to be." "She's capable," Elia said flatly. "I don't doubt it, I don't doubt it at all." Foss's voice went warm in a way that felt like the opposite of warmth. "I just thought, well, come spring, if she's looking for work, my outfit could use someone who knows horses, good wages, better company than a hermit in a valley." The warmth again. "No offense, Kane." "None taken," said Elias, in a tone that meant the opposite. Sable stayed in the barn until Foss rode out 20 minutes later. She heard his horse's hooves on the frozen ground, retreating, and then silence, and then the barn door opened and Elias was there in the frame of it, his shoulders carrying something she hadn't seen on him before. "You heard," he said. "Some of it." He came into the barn. The gray mare bumped his shoulder with her nose and he stroked her absently, looking at nothing. "Foss is not a bad man," he said, carefully, like he was being fair to someone he didn't like. "He's just the kind of man who sees things and wants to own them." Sable watched his face. Is that what he was doing, seeing me? "He was making a point," Elias said, "about things he thought were his business. About me being here. About several things." He looked at her then and his eyes were direct and complicated. "About the fact that a young woman wintering alone with a man is noticed, in town, and talked about." She felt a complicated flash of something, anger partly, at the town, at the talking, at the small-eyed attention of people who made other people's lives into entertainment, and something else underneath the anger, something that was almost hope and hated itself for it. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "What they say?" He held her gaze. "What bothers me," he said, "is that it might make things harder for you." She stared at him. "Not for you." "I've been talked about before," he said simply. "I've learned to live at a distance from other people's opinions." She understood, hearing that he meant something larger than Foss, something that had been building for a long time, a life built deliberately outside the sight lines of judgment. She understood it because she had been building something similar in her own 19-year way for a long time. "I don't care what they say," she said. "You might come spring, when you have somewhere to go." The word spring landed in the room between them like a stone in still water. Rings went out from it. She felt them move through her. "Come spring," she said carefully, "I might not have somewhere particular to go." His expression shifted. Something moved through it quickly, something she almost caught and didn't quite. "Sable," he said, and the way he said her name, the weight he put into 2 syllables, careful and low, made her breath do something complicated. "I'm not a stray," she said before he could finish whatever he was going to say. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "I know I showed up like one, but I'm not. I'm not asking you for anything you haven't already. I'm not making assumptions about—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "I just meant that I don't have somewhere I need to be. That's all." The silence was very long. "That's not what I was going to say," he said quietly. "What were you going to say?" He looked at her for what felt like a long time. The mare shifted between them. Snow slid from the barn roof with a muffled thud. "I was going to say," he said, "that I hope you'll stay." She did not sleep again. It was becoming a pattern. She lay in the loft and stared at the dark ceiling and listened to the cabin breathe around her, and thought about hope, about the architecture of it, how it was the most dangerous thing in the world because it required you to want something, and wanting something gave the world a target. She had spent a long time not wanting things, or wanting them so quietly that even she couldn't hear it. She thought about Elias saying, "I hope you'll stay," and the way his voice had sounded, not a request, not a demand, just a truth he was handing her, carefully, the way he handed everything, like he trusted her to carry it. She thought about the things she hadn't said to him yet, the things that lived in the notebook she'd been writing in, the things that felt too large for words and too real for silence. She thought, what if I told him? The thought was terrifying, and under the terror, like bedrock under snow, something solid, something that had always been there. She had never told anyone about the complicated, plural nature of what she felt, the way her heart moved in different directions toward different people, the way she had loved a girl once, at 16, with a quiet ferocity that she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, the way she'd known since she was old enough to know anything that the world's boxes were not her boxes, that whatever she was not the thing the world had named for her. She had never said it aloud. She had written it in the notebook. She had thought it in the dark for 3 years, but she had never said it to another human being and heard the words exist in real air. She thought about Elias and Thomas, and still true written on the back of an envelope. She thought about a man who had built his life at a distance from other people's opinions. She thought he would understand. And then she thought, understanding is not the same as feeling. And then, why are you thinking about feeling? And then she was thinking about his hands, and the way he'd looked at her in the barn today, and the word stay in his voice. And she was absolutely not sleeping, and the ceiling was very dark, and she was 19 years old and completely lost in the best possible way. February deepened. The cold got its teeth in. There were days when the temperature dropped so hard that going outside for more than 20 minutes was dangerous, and they spent those days in the cabin, close together by necessity, learning each other's rhythms the way people do when space is shared and honest. She learned that he read in the evenings and didn't like to be talked to while reading, but didn't mind her presence near him. He learned that she needed 20 minutes of silence after waking before she was ready to be a person. She learned that he had a quiet laugh he almost never let out, a low, private sound that meant he found something genuinely funny rather than merely amusing. He learned that she could not whistle but tried constantly. "You're getting worse," he said one evening, looking up from his book. "I'm getting better," she said, and tried again. The result was a sound like a wounded bird. "You're not getting better. I'm getting different." He laughed, that quiet, private laugh. She felt it in her chest like a struck match. She was teaching him, or trying to teach him, to play the card game her grandmother had taught her, a complicated thing with obscure rules that Sable herself wasn't entirely certain she remembered correctly. "That can't be right," he said, the third time she called a winning hand on what appeared to be no cards of any value. "My grandmother's rules." "Your grandmother invented rules." "My grandmother improved rules," Sable said primly, and his laugh came again, fuller this time, and she thought, I would do a great deal to hear that sound. There were evenings when they talked until the fire burned low and neither of them noticed until the cold started to creep in. He told her about the land in summer, the way the valley turned green, the way the creek ran high with snowmelt, the way the light lasted until 9 in the evening and filled everything with gold. He told her about a summer 3 years ago when he'd seen a mountain lion with 2 cubs on the ridge above the cabin, watched them for an hour without moving, feeling, he said, like he was being permitted to see something private. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, "out here alone?" He thought about it. "I used to," he said, "less now." She didn't ask him when that had changed. She knew when. "I used to be lonely in crowds," she said. "In town, surrounded by people who thought they knew me." She paused. "It's a worse kind of lonely, The kind where you can't even admit it because you're supposed to have everything you need. Yes, he said quietly, I know that kind. She looked at him across the fire. His face in the low light was all shadow and warmth, the lines of it familiar now in a way that had crept up on her so gradually she hadn't noticed until it was complete. She knew his face the way she knew the view from the cabin window. It was part of the landscape of her days. Elias, she said. He looked up. I need to tell you something. Her voice was steady. She had decided, somewhere in the dark of the loft last night, that she was done not saying things, done carrying them alone in notebooks and sleepless hours. About why I left my town. About me. He set down his book. He gave her his full attention, that particular quality of stillness he had that made you feel like the most important thing in the room. You don't have to, he said. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. She told him. She told him about the girl at 16, the girl named Margaret with red hair, and a way of looking at Sable that had made Sable feel seen and terrified and completely alive. She told him about the town's expectations, the future they'd laid out for her like a road she hadn't built. She told him about the way she felt, the complexity of it, the plural nature of it, loving people in different ways, finding the world's categories too small for what she actually was. She told him about her grandmother, who had known, she thought, who had never said anything but had held her differently than she held other people, a kind of knowing in the arms. She told him, and her voice was steady the whole time, and when she was finished, the room was quiet, and Elias was looking at her with those dark, deep eyes. Thank you, he said. She blinked. For what? For trusting me with that. The steadiness she'd maintained wobbled, just slightly. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs. I've never said it aloud before, she said, any of it. How does it feel? His voice was very gentle. She thought about it. Like putting something down that was very heavy, she said. And also like being afraid that the person you handed it to won't want to carry it. I want to carry it, he said. Simple as that. I want to carry it. Like it was the most natural thing. Like there was no version of this moment in which he would have said anything else. She felt something happen in her eyes that she absolutely refused to permit, and she looked at the fire, and she breathed. You're a strange man, Elias Kane, she said when she could talk again. I've been told. I mean it kindly. I know you do. The thaw came early that year, the way thaws sometimes do, not gradually, the way they're supposed to, but suddenly like the world had made a decision. One morning in early March, Sable woke to the sound of water running, and she lay in the loft listening to it for a full minute before she understood what she was hearing. The creek, running free, the ice breaking up overnight. She climbed down from the loft. Elias was already awake, standing at the window with his coffee, watching the valley. She went and stood beside him. The snow was melting from the south-facing slopes in long, dark rivulets. The air, when she cracked the door, had a smell she hadn't encountered in months: wet earth, cold water, the green-ahead smell of something waking up. The mountains were still white above the tree line, but below, the world was returning to itself. Spring, she said. Early one, he said. She looked at the valley. The thaw meant roads. The thaw meant town, people, connection to the world beyond this particular valley and this particular cabin and this particular fire. The thaw meant the future, which she had been successfully avoiding thinking about since January. I should probably, she started. You don't have to, he said. Exactly the same words he'd used when she'd told him about herself. You don't have to. She was starting to understand this was the thing he gave people instead of chains. I know I don't have to. She said it the same way she'd said it then. I'm trying to figure out what I want. She heard his breathing change slightly, just slightly. What does that look like? He asked. She looked at the valley, at the water threading down the slope in silver lines, at the enormous sky, which was the particular blue of early March mornings, deep and cold and endless. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said, "about being made of a place, about leaving feeling like something you weren't capable of." He was very still beside her. "I didn't have a place like that," she said. "I thought I was just placeless, that there wasn't anywhere I was made of." She paused. "But I think maybe places aren't always about land." She felt him turn to look at her. She kept looking at the valley. "Sable," he said. "I'm not saying it to make things complicated," she said quickly. "I'm saying it because I've been doing the thing where I don't say things, and I decided I was done with that." "I know." His voice was low and careful. "I've been happier here than I've been anywhere. And I know part of that is the quiet and the land and having something to do with my hands. But part of it is," she stopped, started again. "Part of it is you. And I don't know what to do with that because you had Thomas, and Thomas was something specific. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to be something I'm not. I'm not trying to fit into a shape that doesn't fit." "Sable." His voice was gentle, firm, the voice he used when the horses were nervous. She stopped talking. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that quality of attention she'd never been able to name, the way he looked at her that made her feel like something worth being careful with. His eyes were very warm in the morning light. "I told you the night you arrived," he said slowly, "that the fire was already yours. Do you remember?" "I didn't understand what you meant." "No," he said, "I know. I didn't entirely understand it either." He was quiet for a moment. "I think I was saying something true before I had language for it, the way you sometimes do." Her heart was doing something complicated and involuntary, and she could not slow it down. "What were you saying?" He looked at her for a long time, the kind of long time that has weight to it. "That you were familiar," he said. "That something in you was already known to me, before I knew your name or your story or any of it." He paused. "I've only felt that once before. I think you know when." "Thomas," yes, she knew. "I'm not asking you to be Thomas," she said. It came out almost like a whisper. "I know you're not." He reached up and tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, the first time he had touched her face, the first deliberate, intentional touch, and his hand lingered there, warm at her jaw. "I'm not asking you to be anyone but who you are." She felt the whole world go very quiet, not the emptiness quiet, the other kind. "I'm not even sure what that is yet," she said. "Neither am I," he said. "Entirely." Something shifted in his expression, something careful and honest. "What I know is that you walked out of a blizzard and sat across my fire, and in the weeks since, the walls have stopped moving in. And I'd like, if you're willing, to know more of what that is." She looked at him. The valley spread out behind him, all thaw and possibility, the sky enormous above the mountains. "I'm willing," she said. He kissed her the way he did everything, carefully, without hurry, with complete attention to what was happening. It was not a dramatic thing. There was no thunder in it, no sudden surging movement. She had half expected something cinematic, the kind of moment she'd read about in novels, where the world tilts on its axis and everything goes golden. Instead, it was quiet and warm and felt like something that had been decided a long time ago and was only now getting around to being stated aloud. His hand was still at her jaw. His thumb moved just slightly against her cheekbone. He looked at her for a moment, asking. She understood, and she answered by closing the distance herself, because she was Sable Voss, and she had never waited for anyone else to decide things for her, and she was not going to start. It was warm. That was the word she would always use for it after. Not passionate, not urgent, warm. Like sitting by the fire at the end of a long, cold day and feeling the heat reach bone. Like coming in from outside and having the cold leave you all at once. She pulled back first and looked at him, and his eyes were very dark and very close, and he looked the way she felt, a little disoriented, a little careful, a little awed by the specific moment. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. The valley glittered beyond the window. Meltwater ran in silver threads. The sky was the blue of early spring and went on forever. It wasn't simple after that. It was never going to be simple. Two people with complicated hearts and long histories of carrying things alone were not going to become simple just because they'd told each other the truth. There were mornings when the walls came back in, for both of them. There were conversations that went sideways and had to be straightened out slowly, with patience and with honesty. There were nights when Elias went quiet in the way he went quiet when Thomas was nearby in his memory, and Sable learned to sit with him in that quiet rather than try to fill it, because some grief is not a problem to be solved, and the best you can do for it is keep someone company while it passes. There was a day in late March when Foss came back, this time with a business proposition about water rights, and Elias handled it with the same contained precision he brought to everything. And afterward Sable noticed that his jaw was tight in a particular way, and she said, "You handled that well," and he said, "I hate that I have to," and she said, "I know," and they left it there, which was exactly right. There were conversations she needed to have with herself, about what she was building here, about whether she was staying because she wanted to stay or because she was afraid to leave, about the difference between a home you chose and a hole you hid in. She went on long rides alone with Elias' gray mare and had those conversations with the open country, and the open country, being large and patient, accommodated them. She wrote in her notebook. She wrote, "I think I am the kind of person who loves with their whole self rather than the part of their self the world has a name for. I think this is either a gift or a problem, and I am working on believing it is the former." She wrote, "He makes me want to stay. That's new. I've never wanted to stay anywhere before. I don't know if that's love or safety or both, and I'm not sure the distinction matters as much as I thought it did." She wrote, "The sky keeps everyone. My grandmother was right." April came, and with it the valley in green, the lush, almost violent green of land that has been under snow for months and is making up for lost time. Elias had been right about summer. She watched it coming and felt it like a promise. She rode into town with him in the second week of April to resupply. It was the first time she'd been in any town since January. She'd forgotten the noise of it, the density of people, the layered sound of horses and voices and commerce, all the complicated negotiations that humans require of each other in groups. People looked at them. She felt the looking. She was aware, in a way she hadn't been in the valley, of how they must appear, a man and a young woman riding together, comfortable in each other's company in the way that takes time to build. She was aware of the questions the looking contained. She waited for the familiar dread, the feeling of being seen wrong, measured wrong, found wanting. It didn't come. What came instead was a strange, quiet solidity, like finding out the ground was deeper than you thought. She was Sable Voss, and she was here, and she was herself, all of herself, the complicated, plural, uncontainable self that the world had been trying to fit into a box since she was old enough to be noticed, and the towns looking could not reach whatever she had built over the winter, whatever she and Elias had built. She bought supplies. She talked to the woman at the dry goods counter who had warm eyes and quick hands and who said, looking between Sable and Elias with something that was almost approval, "You're the one wintering up in the Cane Valley." Not a question. "I am," said Sable. "Good," said the woman. Just that. Good. Like she'd been waiting for someone to answer something she'd been wondering for a long time. Riding out of town, the supply packs full, the spring air warm for the first time that year, Elias said, "You all right?" "I'm all right," she said. He looked at her sideways. The corner of his mouth moved. "Good." She laughed. It came out of her without warning, a real laugh, full and easy, and he looked at her and let his own smile come completely for once, and they rode out through the spring-green countryside toward the valley that was hers too now, toward the fire that had always been hers, toward the life that was still being built but had, unmistakably, already begun. Years later, and yes, there were years, the kind built quietly and stubbornly and well, the kind that don't announce themselves but accumulate like snowfall. Each day adding to the depth of the thing, Sable Voss would try to explain to someone what it had been like, that first winter. She would say, it was not a love story exactly. Not the kind with a clear beginning and a clear shape and a clear name. It was more like, she would pause here, searching for the right words, more like a conversation that kept going. A fire that kept being added to. Not one dramatic flame, but a long, consistent warmth that built itself out of small truths and smaller kindnesses and the accumulated days of two people choosing, over and over, to know each other. She would say, I walked out of a blizzard. I sat across a fire from a man who made space for me before he knew my name. And everything that happened after happened because of that, because he made space, and I was brave enough eventually to take up the space he made. She would say, I learned that home is not always a place. Sometimes it is a quality of attention. Sometimes it is the particular patience of someone who waits for you to put down what you've been carrying without asking you to hurry. She would say, I don't know if I believe in fate, but I believe I walked out of that blizzard and found exactly what I didn't know I was looking for, and that's close enough. The fire in the stone fireplace that Elias had rebuilt with his own hands would burn low by then, and he would be in the other room, and she would hear the sound of him moving, those quiet, deliberate movements, nothing wasted, and her chest would do the thing it always did, that warm, involuntary movement that she had stopped trying to name and started simply receiving. He would come to the door. He would look at her the way he always looked at her, patient and careful and deep, with that quality of attention that made her feel like something worth being careful with. You're telling the story again, he would say. Someone asked, she would say. And you couldn't resist. I never can. He would cross the room in those unhurried steps and sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and the fire would make its sounds, and the valley would be outside in whatever season it was, it didn't matter. The valley was the valley in all of them, green or white or gold or bare, always itself, always vast enough, and they would be in it together, which was the whole of the story in the end. The sky keeps everyone, and that, beloved reader, is where their story, the part that can be spoken, comes to rest. But wait, because you and I both know there are things Sable still hasn't said aloud. Things written in the back of a notebook she keeps in the drawer beside the bed. Things Elias knows are there and has never asked about, because that is who he is, but which are getting closer, every day, to being ready to be said. What do you think she wrote in that notebook? And do you think he already knows? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story found something in you, if it warmed you the way a real fire does from the inside out, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Every story I tell is built for people who feel things deeply and need a place to feel them. And the question I'm leaving you with tonight: should I tell you what happened the spring after? The spring when a letter arrived from back east, addressed to Elias in a bold, slanted hand. Because that story changes everything. Until next time, keep the fire burning.